Hello, my name is Zachary Ellis, and this is my presentation on George Lucas's Star Wars franchise. The Star Wars cinematic franchise began in 1977 with the release of A New Hope. It was directed and written by George Lucas and had a opening weekend of $1.5 million, with a total domestic grossing of $307 million. With this trend, it was very obvious to all involved that this could be an extremely lucrative IP. So 3 years later, The Empire Strikes Back is released, directed by Irvin Kershner, and still written by George Lucas, with an opening weekend of 4.9 million and a domestic gross total of 209 million. Finally, 3 years after that, the last of this trilogy, Return of the Jedi, is this time directed by Richard Marquand, with an opening weekend of 23 million and a domestic gross total of 252 million. This trilogy itself, the original trilogy, follows the story of Luke, Leia, and Han Solo, where Luke is the son of Darth Vader and is revealed to be a Jedi by Ben Kenobi, who died in A New Hope, and Leia becomes a figurehead leader of the rebellion against the Empire, who was obviously then figureheaded by Darth Vader and secretly being controlled by Emperor Palpatine, and Han Solo is the struggler who Leia later falls in love with, who obviously has Chewie by his side, and the companion is also or the companions that follow this trio along are C-3PO and R2-D2. Nearly 20 years later, the Star Wars IP was revisited in the prequel trilogy. All three of these movies were to be directed by George Lucas. They began in 1999 with the release of The Phantom Menace, with a domestic weekend gross of 64 million, with a weekend gross of 64 million, domestic gross of 431 million. Its reception was not the best. It was more directed towards kids and had characters such as Jar Jar that really took they really more slapstick humor and gave Star Wars a kind of kiddish undertone that many didn't really appreciate. 3 years later, in 2002, Attack of the Clones came out, which dialed back down on the Jar Jar tones with a much more serious war-centered theme. Its opening weekend was 80 million with a domestic gross of 302 million. In my opinion, it's the most forgettable, least liked of the trilogy. I liked Phantom Menace more. I liked Attack of the Clones. Although the ending was a lot better. Revenge of the Sith, arguably the best of the prequel trilogy, came out in 2005, and it was the first Star Wars movie I saw in theaters. It had an opening weekend of $108 million with a total domestic gross of $380 million, and featured scenes such as General Grievous's death and the best scene of all of the prequels, the final duel on Mustafar between Darth Vader and Obi-Wan before Darth Vader was in his metal suit when he was just Anakin Skywalker. This prequel trilogy, from beginning to end, follows the story of Anakin Skywalker, who does become Darth Vader and who is the father of Luke Skywalker from the original trilogy. The Phantom Menace tells the story of being a slave on Tatooine, where he is taken up by Qui-Gon Jinn, who is played by Liam Neeson, but after Qui-Gon Jinn is killed by Darth Maul, who is another really one of the best features of the first film, is then taken up by Obi-Wan Kenobi as his Padawan, who is played by Ewan McGregor. Obviously, over the course of this trilogy, that relationship sours as Anakin develops a love interest, which is against the Jedi ways, and ultimately Chancellor Palpatine, who becomes Emperor Palpatine later, uses this to twist Anakin to the dark side. Some years later, after the end of Revenge of the Sith, but a little bit before the acquisition of Lucasfilm by Disney, Star Wars: The Clone Wars was aired first as a feature-length movie in 2008. They were all animated, and then as its own dedicated TV show on Cartoon Network, which had a Friday night primetime slot. That also came out in 2008, and it aired for 6 seasons on television, and then a final season, which was nearly almost done, was cut off of television as Disney acquired Lucasfilm, obviously, and didn't want the competition, but that seventh season was released on Netflix, and it was called The Lost Episodes. And then Disney took its own crack at making a Star Wars TV show, and it was called Star Wars Rebels, and it debuted in October 2014, airing on Disney XD, and it is now currently on its fourth and what has been announced to be its final season, and it is being directed by Dave Filoni, who was one of the producers of Star Wars: The Clone Wars. Rebels was not as well um, accepted as Star Wars: The Clone Wars because after when Star Wars: The Clone Wars became an accepted medium and when it had its own huge fan base and when people were really rooting for it to be successful, it had dark, gritty undertones, which was really unlike anything we've seen in the movies because they usually had such wholesome endings, except for maybe Revenge of the Sith. Uh, but it was a war, it was more like war stories than anything else. And then Star Wars Rebels would return to that kid, wholesome, family-friendly, light versus dark, where light always wins, that the original trilogy had, where it really had no grit and there really didn't seem like there were many stakes at hand. And many hardcore fans of the Clone Wars didn't like it and felt that Disney was cheating those fans out and not really taking into account how they felt about the IP as a whole. Since Star Wars' conception and its acceptance, it has been one of the most defining features of our society and one of the most quintessential cultural icons. Once again, since its conception, since 1977, there have been many, many, many books which all have been retconned since Disney's acquisition. But there have been many books written, many video games, including Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic, Battlefront 2. There's another Battlefront 2 that came out now. There have been many toys. Lego has this huge selection of Star Wars toys. There are trading card games. There are more video games. There are action figures that are really sought after. There are comic books now. Marvel has its own series. Even other IPs such as Family Guy have these entire like feature-length episodes, like entire like swaths of episodes, like Family Guy Star Wars, where every character from Family Guy is turned into a Star Wars character. And you have these series like Robot Chicken, where they have their own Star Wars kind of parody, which both of these are actually really good. They're really funny. I enjoy them. But then you have other pop culture references and other sci-fi shows. You have Luke, I Am Your Father is repeated over and over again that sort of has this quip about nerds or about like that twist in and of itself is a quintessential, dramatic turn that no one really ever expected, and it was done in a Star Wars movie, and no one really seems to give it that much credit. But when you look back at it, you see that Star Wars really has impacted us huge. Whether you see that as a negative or whether you qualify it as it just being nerd culture, it really has, for the most part, turned us into what we are today. And now that Disney's acquisition of Star Wars has kind of come into full force following Rebels and the Marvel Comics line, there has been a new cinematic trilogy line, and there have even been some spin-offs that aren't quite in a trilogy, but are still movies that are being under the Star Wars banner. The Force Awakens released in December 2015 and had a $247 million opening weekend and a $936 million domestic gross, making it one of the top grossing movies ever. Last year, in December 2016, Rogue One, a Star Wars story, came out. It is personally one of my favorite Star Wars movies, with a $155 million opening weekend and a 532 domestic grossing. And this, keep in mind, is one of the movies that is not considered one of the trilogy that follows Rey or Han Solo or any of the Anakin Skywalker lines. It is a prequel to A New Hope, and yet it still has numbers that rival the prequel trilogy that George Lucas came out with not even almost well now more a little more than a decade ago. And finally, this coming month, just a few more weeks, The Last Jedi is coming out, and movie theaters are already sold out of tickets for their opening weekend. I've tried to look myself, and reserves are really, really short. So this is going to easily possibly break $200 million in its opening weekend. And this just goes to show how that even the future generations and generations of old are still enjoying Star Wars. They're not getting enough of it, and Disney is really sinking its teeth into that. These are some citations that I have. Box Office Mojo is really what pushed those numbers I gave for grossings for the weekends in the total. And IMDb gave me some information on the lengths of Rebels and Star Wars: The Clone Wars. Otherwise, everything I really knew myself and was mostly my opinion. And then I also looked at the Star Wars website just out of curiosity because it talks about some of the production steps that were taken pre New Hope. And while I didn't really directly reference any of that, it was still something I used up to look.